Do our global institutions like the UN, like NATO, like the G7 have any utility in today's geopolitical landscape? Do they still control outcomes? Do they still represent global economic strength and wealth? And do they have any influence whatsoever? I debate this today with my guest, the esteemed geopolitical analyst, Glenn Diesen, and I learned a lot. I hope you enjoy this episode. This is the Jay Martin Show, where we dissect the greatest minds in geopolitics and finance so that we can better understand the world. Here is Glenn Diesen. Enjoy.
This is Jay Martin.
Okay, here I am with Glenn Diesen. Glenn, it's great to have you back on the program. Thank you so much for making the time.
It's my pleasure. Thank you for having me on.
Well, there's a handful of subjects I want to get into today, and many I want to go deep into. I want to start, however, with an understanding of your higher level thinking of the geopolitical chessboard today. And so how do you process which alliances have meaningful impact today? And I think about the history of geopolitical alliances of the past, whether organizations like the G7, for example, which was supposed to be an informal grouping of the world's most advanced democracies to have those very important economic discussions. If you look at the members of the G7 today, I don't think they're the best choice to impact global events, right? Countries like Italy, France, Germany, not nearly as influential or wealthy or as productive as they used to be. Are we in a state of flux globally right now where there aren't really any alliances that have true substance? Or do you see trading blocs, regional blocs, geopolitical alliances that do have staying power that exist today?
Well, I think you should differentiate between the geopolitical blocs or military alliances versus, as you said, the geoeconomic blocs, because I think there will be more and more focus on the geoeconomic blocs. That is how trade is organized, trade routes, the cooperation on tech industries, common banking, what kind of currencies you would use. I think because the system we had since World War II has been organized and primarily around the United States. So we use American technologies, industries, its currency, its banks. But as we now go towards a more multipolar system, it can take many different shapes. And I think that the most likely one seems now to be a more fragmented one, because it's not going to be, I think, a very peaceful one. I think countries like the United States will try to carve out its own geoeconomic regions. So this is why it's reviving, for example, the Monroe Doctrine in a very different kind of form, of course, that is to have some more exclusive influence. It wants the Europeans to cut off from all other centers of power and only make themselves dependent on the US. And so you have now these exclusive spheres being shaped. And I think this is going to be more likely to shape some of the restructuring of the world now that the previous open economic system is coming to an end. But in terms of international institutions, I tend to take a view very much along with political realism, which is that institutions, they are peaceful, they're stable, and to the extent they can actually reflect the current international distribution of power. That is, look at the United Nations, for example. After the Second World War, the reason why it would give veto powers to the dominant 5 states is because this is the proper reflection of power. You want to give special privileges to the main powers, because then the great powers have an interest in preserving that order, that system where they have this veto, which is why I'm always skeptical when people say, well, let's just get rid of the veto power, because all you do then is make sure that the great powers don't have the same interest in keeping the UN and the current system of international law, and you will instead force them to use more military power instead. So I think that it should always reflect the international distribution of power. So that's why I do think, for example, the UN needs some changes as well if we want to preserve it, but then you would need a bigger role for countries like India, because the idea that in the current international system, the French should have a veto power, but the Indians do not. It no longer represents the international system. Over time, as India grows more powerful, why would it want to follow a system like this? So I do think that a lot of the way we look at institutions, they have to reform and adjust to reality. I think this is a problematic for many of the Western countries, because in the past, the Western countries were more powerful, so they have this privileged position. But because they were also liberal democracies as opposed to many other parts of the world, we also created an ideology around it. That is, it's not because of our power, it's because of our values. When we dominate, it's for the benefit of the whole international system. Now, of course, that the West the power is no longer there. Well, you can argue the values aren't there either. The West, many Western countries are still going to demand a privileged status simply because they tell themselves they have superior values, even though the power is gone. So it's very hard, I think, for especially the Europeans to accept this new international system where they don't have the same role. So they will start to focus more on why they deserve it, as opposed to why the power distribution isn't there anymore. Now, you asked very specifically about the G7, though, because again, these were the main 7 economies, but they've already been replaced. Now you have the BRICS countries are now collectively stronger than the G7. So there's going to be incentives now to change it, because the G7 can't do anything. The idea that the most powerful economies would then come together, sit down, and try to keep, well, I guess, the main pieces in place and harmonize the development of the international system, it doesn't work with the G7 anymore. It's a useless bloc to a large extent. Even when Trump suggested Russia should get back into the G8, they're not really interested. They see their future belonging more in the BRICS geoeconomic region. So I see big changes coming along. But you can also ask, why would the United States? Because that's an actual powerful economy in terms of GDP. It's still the largest economy. So what are their interests in staying in the G7? It can be useful as an exclusive geoeconomic bloc where they cut out the Russians, Chinese, and others. But I do think that they still want to find a new G7 that is a group of relevant states, powerful states. So I heard some reports, or seen some reports, that the Trump administration would like to have a new core 5, that is the United States, Japan, China, Russia, and India. So to have these 5 powers, so no Europeans in there except for Russia, but this is the main idea, to have the new great powers sit down and try to harmonize interests so they don't clash to too great of an extent.
I was going to ask you what your thoughts were on the core 5, because it struck me as interesting, and I'd have to wonder if you're if you're President Modi, President Putin, President Xi, if you're hearing this language like the core 5, and it's coming from America, coming from a president who might not be around in 3 years, but you're sitting in a country that hasn't had to worry about elections for a long time, how much weight you'd actually put on that? Because this is a proposal from what could be a very fleeting leadership, which tends to be the case, right? In modern democracies, we pivot left, right incredibly quickly. And I want to maybe dive into that, but just because you mentioned the Monroe Doctrine, and everybody right now is talking about Venezuela, and I think these two things are obviously related. You discuss sort of the resurrection of the Monroe Doctrine in today's political commentary, but it's different, right, than the original promise of or idea of the Monroe Doctrine, which, as I understand, was kind of like, you stay out of our backyard and we will stay out of yours. And that second part was just as important as the first part, but that second part seems to be absent from the conversation today. Is that accurate, Glenn? And how would you describe the origins of the Monroe Doctrine for somebody who's never heard of it before? Maybe let's start there. Like, I've heard people talking about this. I don't know what it is. What was the idea behind the origin and the utility, and how has that changed and shifted today?
Well, in the beginning of the 19th century, the Americans did not care much for Europe or the European imperialists. So it wasn't even common to to speak about, the Western nations, because the US was supposed to rid itself and not participate in this kind of colonial structures and imperialism like the Europeans did. This is why it became very controversial after 1898, when the US defeated the Spanish and got all these colonial conquests from all across Americas to the Philippines. So the US therefore had this anti-imperialist mindset. Now you can argue that they wanted to dominate their own region. I think that's a reasonable criticism, but irrespective of that, the Monroe Doctrine was formulated as being anti-imperialist. That is, keep the imperial rivalry of the Europeans out of the Americas. So, but now, of course, how it's reimagined is more or less as an imperial policy. I mean, if you only look at what's happening now, you have Rubio keep dreaming about strangling Cuba. There's preparations for war with Venezuela. They tell the Colombians are next. Mexico, Trump recently said they can't rule out any strikes on Mexico either, if this will stop the drugs they claim. So there's, we had the Panama Canal as well, where they wrestled out some concessions. Otherwise, the US would take back the Panama Canal. So you have all this, new bullying which is taking place. So this is not keeping empires out. This is asserting the US empire, which is a different thing. But what you refer to is also the idea that if other countries should stay out of America's backyard, this is again one of the core ideas of the Monroe Doctrine. Then the initial Monroe Doctrine then had some clause of reciprocity. That is, that the US should not then go into the backyards of other great powers. Overall, I think this is a good policy to have. That is, when I, for example, see China and Russia sending military arms to Venezuela, I don't think I can understand why they need defense, but I think it's very dangerous to start to play around with military force in the backyard of other countries. But for it to be stable, you can have it in a form of a great power agreement. That is, it will stay out of your backyard, you stay away from ours, and ideally do it in a framework where it's not imperialist, where we don't try to dominate our own neighbors. But here, of course, the US seems to, or the Trump administration breaks on both of these issues, because it is a very imperialist view of this new Monroe Doctrine. And of course, it will be very unilateral. That is, no one should be in the Western Hemisphere, but the US will still position itself on the borders of all the other great powers. So it will penetrate Eurasia any way it can. So it's it doesn't really make much sense from this perspective. And I think this is because it's a policy which now recognizes that there is a multipolar distribution of power. However, there are still the aspirations for restoring unipolarity. So I think this is at least how I would explain it. And it's not going to get consent from any of the other great powers. So no, it's going to be very confrontational.
As you explain that, and I notice some of John Mersheimer's work behind you on the bookshelf, and you talked about sort of the great power agreement concept, and it just led me to think there was no avoiding this situation we find ourselves in today on the global stage, this era of very uncertain future, uncertain alliances and adversaries, and potential for very large conflicts. And that's because we've just outgrown some of those agreements that prevented that in the past. We've outgrown the G7, we've outgrown NATO, we've outgrown unipolarity, and now have to find a way to manage multipolarity. And if we're able to figure out some kind of great power agreement between the powers that really matter, that would be the path towards avoidance of some kind of a World War III scenario, right? But it's dependent on us finding that equal footing, that compromise between the great powers that matter. And in failing to do that, we probably continue to fall down the road of increased regional conflicts every year and a half, another is budding and emerging. There's, many regions globally right now that are incredibly tense, flashpoints like the Caribbean, like the South China Sea, et cetera. And these could go off in short order. Do you think that's accurate? Like, is that the antidote to the next major global conflict is us finding that next generation of global power, great power agreement. Is that a fair thought? What's your take?
No, yes, and that's why usually you would get these great power agreements after major wars.
Right.
But yeah, but this is where we're walking now towards major wars, because otherwise you would need some diplomatic giants in order to recognize the direction the world is going, that we're heading towards major wars, and we would try to solve them now. But if you listen to political leaderships around the world, and then especially the Europeans, it's there's no political maturity there. There's no willingness to discuss just the basic structure of the international system. Is all like just a language of, well, we're the goodies, they're the baddies. Obviously, we don't need to talk about security guarantees for baddies because they're bad. It's only for the good guys and the victim who should have this kind of right. So it's an absurd, completely absurd environment we're currently in. But I agree with that we're outgrowing a lot of these things, and this is why there has to be some reforms and restructurings. Keep in mind that after the Cold War, when we decided to pursue an international system based on hegemony, this was what manifested as NATO expansion, that is a collective hegemony over Europe. So instead of having an inclusive pan-European security architecture, where the Russians would also have a seat at the table, we said, we don't need this. We'll just expand NATO. Everyone should be included except for the Russians. And we're, in forms of institutions, just push it out of Europe. And a lot of the criticism which came from the top diplomats in the US, but also those who supported it, recognized that, well, of course, the Russians would then react very negatively to this. But the assumption was, well, they're just weak. They're weak, and they're getting weaker. So our role should be to manage their decline. So the role of Russia should be some weak, if not the disintegrating power, or almost orbiting Europe. It should be outside Europe, but it should still follow the decision making done in Europe. This was also the argument, by the way, by William Perry, who was the U.S. Secretary of Defense under Bill Clinton, and he was also making the point that he was criticizing NATO expansion. He said it would lead to a disaster, but he made the point that everyone in the administration realized this would alienate Russia, but it didn't matter because they were weak. Well, what has happened now? Russia has grown stronger and stronger, and this European model doesn't work anymore. We're the largest country in Europe in terms of population, territory, military, and economy, is the only one without a seat at the table. It doesn't make any sense. But we're kind of locked into this form now. Where we just say, well, this is the only acceptable format for Europe, and we won't discuss anything else. Well, this form no longer works. So we're now entering a war because we don't have diplomats who can solve this through negotiations. And you can argue the same in East Asia. The idea that stability and peace in East Asia should be ensured only by these bilateral security deals between the US and its allies it's not going to work. When China has grown so powerful, and security, it outgrown the US led not just economic system, but also the security architecture. It's not going to have US warships patrolling its coastline, having all its main physical trade corridors managed by the US Navy, which is its main rival, which can cut it off. It doesn't make any sense. So now that this isn't working, the Chinese, of course, will begin to build up their own army because of the US threat, and the US will pick up on this. They will begin to build alliances and army against the Chinese, and you will be in this security competition. So if you want to escape this, as you suggested, we have to realize that the old system has been outgrown. The distribution of power is no longer there. But again, if we don't have diplomats who are capable of doing this, we'll have war. And we don't have diplomats who are able to do this, it seems.
And to a degree, that sort of makes sense. You want to hang on to the power you earned in the past, whether or not you deserve it today. And you said this directly. There's maybe European leaders that feel like they should be included in these major conversations. They deserve it, given their history, right? That doesn't make them relevant today. Sad to say. but that's the political maturity, I think, that you referenced. And your first comment to my question was those new great power agreements often come after a major war. And right away I was like, yes, because no one's going to willingly let go of their influence. They have to be forced away from the table sometimes, unfortunately. And I hope not, but that's what history shows us, is that people don't go down without a fight. And okay, so
Well, if
I
I can
want to,
just a quick comment.
please,
The
please.
slogan of NATO since the 1990s, whenever the Russians said, "Well, we should have a say as well, where you put your missiles. If you're going to put your missiles on our border, we should have a say." And we essentially said, "No, no, no. Europe is NATO. NATO represents Europe, and you do not have a veto power over NATO. So you don't get a veto power, which means you don't have any say over Russia, well, over Europe." Well, this kind of institutions and logic made sense when the NATO countries were overwhelmingly dominant. But when the power shifts and now Russia, it no longer reflects the actual distribution of power. If we tell the Russians, you don't have an institutional voice, so you will have to go away. No, well, then now they can assert themselves militarily. So the Europeans are holding on to power which they no longer have. And the Russians are imposing themselves because of the institutional power they were denied. So again, the institutions should reflect this shift somehow. The hegemony is gone. The Russians are a big power in Europe. But as you suggested, there's a speech by Kaja Kallas where she makes the point, well, Russia shouldn't have any security guarantees in Europe because they're the aggressor. Ukraine should have all the security guarantees because they're a victim, and we are fighting for freedom. So this is how they view the world, and this is how they hold on to an outdated security arrangement. And but again, at the end of the day, if you don't give an institutional voice that reflects the actual distribution of power, then they will assert themselves in different ways. And sorry, I didn't want to go too long about that, but that was the same with the economic architecture. Keep in mind that the Chinese said for a long time the United States have to accept to reform the IMF because it no longer represents the actual distribution of power. The Americans didn't want to do this. So then the Chinese just established, for example, the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank back in 2015. They just established then a parallel economic architecture because the former one is no longer reflecting reality. This is what happens. You have to reform the institutions or they die. Often they die in wars.
If the organizations do not recognize the actual distribution of power, what you said there, I thought that was just bang on, because power shifts and evolves and matures and countries rise and decline. And if the organizations don't recognize that, then inevitably you're going to revert back to the geopolitical mean, which is that sort of offensive realism theory, right? Where at the end of the day, the power do what they want and the weak suffer what they must, which is a hard thing to hear, but that's the mean that we always return to during these moments of geopolitical instability. Would you agree with that? That the sort of liberalism argument that democracies don't go to war with democracies, and so therefore we should all be democracies and the world will experience peace, sounds lovely and can maintain status quo peace for a period of time until the chessboard shifts and evolves so much that those organizations no longer respect the actual distribution of power. And then we revert back to offensive realism for a period of time until the next thing emerges. Is that accurate?
No, I think that's very accurate. So, this is what we need now. The great powers coming together and agreeing on a new status quo. And so towards this extent, it actually makes sense that the Americans are trying to put together this core five arrangements over the heads of the Europeans, because the major shift in this new world is, the main rising power is China, and the main power which has become irrelevant is Europe. And as Europeans, it doesn't make me happy to say that, but this is the reality. And this is for the same reason why the Europeans are the ones who are holding on to the former order as much as possible. That is, keep the institutions of the 90s and then hope that this will, this is the reality which will continue. There's an amazing exchange with the president of Finland, who talking to some, I forgot which one, but some of counterparts in Asia, and he was making the point, why multipolarity is full of conflict, it's not a good thing. and essentially just trust the political West to dominate because we have the best values. I mean, it's insane. It's really crazy, and of course, but they're allowed to talk like this in Europe because anyone who counters them, well, they're Putinist or an apologist for Xi or something along those lines. I mean, they behave and speak like children, very dangerous children, but nonetheless, this doesn't make any sense at all. But they have withdrawn into this comfortable, fantasy world, I would say.
Yeah, it's like endemic, and I don't know if you can ever get away from that. It's just the natural evolution of any organization, and you can think about a business the same way. There's a certain set of theories and principles that will govern you very effectively as a small, budding, aggressive startup. And as the corporation grows, if successful, demands change. But generally speaking, as that occurs, you have people who are there from day one who don't want to change the status quo. They want to hold on to how things were and often respond to those new, disruptive, necessary, innovative ideas with a condescending tone that we've always done it this way and it'll be just fine. And that's like, it's a tipping point in a company's journey, usually, that determines whether or not they keep moving forward or they don't. And every entrepreneur is familiar with that. I want to circle the Caribbean a little bit with you here and get your perspective and how you interpret these moves, because we're watching the greatest assembly of U.S. military power in about 30 years. And the narrative is that we need to intervene in this narco state. And secondly, that this is a country governed by an oppressive dictator and the people need release and freedom. So unpacking either of those two assumptions, number one, the narco state, okay, well, fentanyl precursors come from China, manufactured in Myanmar, enter the United States through Mexico. If you're really serious about tackling a narco state, you wouldn't start with Venezuela. Cocaine, the same thing. Think Colombia, think Ecuador, think Mexico. Venezuela is not where you would start if that was the true mission. In terms of oppressing the people, just step back and look at the rest of the world. Spend 5 minutes reading about what's happening in South Sudan right now, and then tell me that humanity is the reason we're looking at Venezuela. It doesn't stack up whatsoever. So what else could be at play? The obvious answer is the deepest oil reserves on the planet. So that's why. That's always been why, and it's why today. However, Maduro has, as I understand, come to the table and said, we're willing to do any deal you want to do. The door is open for U.S. business, all of our resources. Whatever deals you want to do, let's do them. And this has been met with deaf ears from the West and from the American president. I sat down with a geopolitical analyst, George Friedman, who's the founder of Geopolitical Futures and Stratfor back in the day. What he pointed to was, he's like, what people don't understand or haven't noticed is that this assembly of U.S. military in the Caribbean began in August. In March, there was a new defense pact signed between Cuba and Russia. And in June, Russian subs and ships arrived in Cuban waters 90 miles off the coast of the U.S. And this is a resurgence, and this defense pact includes the ability for a resurgence of Cold War era bases on Cuba, missile launch pads, military infrastructure. Anything that both Cuban and the Russian governments agree to can now occur again in Cuba. And that's given Cuba's sort of like the corkscrew in between the global marketplace and America's economic hub, being the Gulf of Mexico, America, oil refinery, the mouth of the Mississippi River. It's the most important economic gem in the country for the U.S. is the Gulf of America, Gulf of Mexico. And Cuba stands between it and the global marketplace. So that's why this military strength has showed up 4 months after that defense pact was signed. I don't know what to make of any of it, Glenn. I've got some assumptions and I can speculate all day long. How are you interpreting what's occurring in the Caribbean right now? What's substance, what's noise, what's signal?
Well, this narco terrorism, I mean, they're just putting naughty words together there. I think it doesn't really make that much sense. I do miss the days of the weapons of mass destructions and the war on terror, at least, but they built up over time some cohesive arguments that they sold it to the public over a long period of time through the media. But no, this narco-terrorism thing, it lacks a lot of the logic behind it. But also you have Trump, of course, giving has been giving speeches for some of them very open, where he talks about how close they were in his first administration to collapse Venezuela and get their hands on all their oil. So they're already spoken quite open about this, but. So yeah, Venezuela has a lot of natural resources. Oil, of course, they have the largest reserve. So it's very attractive to have it this close to the United States. This, by the way, what Machado as well, the Nobel Peace Prize winner, keeps saying in these different interviews as well, that if Maduro falls and presumably she takes power, then all of this resource can be privatized and end up to the United States. And it's not going to be far away in the Middle East. It's going to be right in his backyard. So I think that, this makes perfect sense. But it's also more, I think, in the stronger interest right now because the world is becoming more multipolar. The US can't dominate every corner of the world. So it makes sense then that the United States should at least dominate its own backyard, especially as countries like Russia and China will begin to assert themselves in other places. So again, carve out an exclusive geoeconomic region for the United States. So I think it's important for the US that these resources, not only do they go to the United States, the US will be the main security provider in the region, that it should not have any military infrastructure coming or any missiles, any weapons coming from the Chinese or the Russians. The Venezuelans should not just sell this to the Americans. They should pay in dollars. They should use the American banks. Overall, they have to conform with the U.S. International economic architecture, and of course, geopolitically fall in line as well. So, I assume that this falls within what we talked about, the new Monroe Doctrine.
Okay. Yeah.
It feels almost like blasphemy, by the way, to call it a Monroe Doctrine, because I don't think Monroe would have approved, but there you go.
Right. Yeah. No doubt. Okay. And I guess that makes sense. Your comment about privatization, right? When I think about it's probably about the oil, but then I look at the fact that Maduro's already come to the table and said, we can do the oil deal. Whatever the deal is you want to do, we'll do it, right? And not just oil, the rest of our resources. We're open for business. If I get to stay in power, that was the caveat. You leave me alone and we can do the deals. But maybe that's not enough if you're looking to privatize those industries, which makes way more sense, right? Who's really pushing the influence behind the scenes? And what can Halliburton do the deal it really wants to do until they control the leadership, right? And I don't know if the answer is as clear cut as maybe I thought it was. What's your take on, and do you have one, Glenn, on the new defense pact between Cuba and Russia? Is it meaningful? Is it something very different from the past, or is this just, Russian officials have come out and said this is reciprocal action for the long-range missiles the U.S. has provided Ukraine, right? You put competency in our backyard, we'll put competency in yours, right? And this is just tit for tat reciprocity. Do you have a take on that? What do you think?
Well, it could be. I know that the Russians would mind some leverage then against the United States, because over the past 4 years, you can go back to 2014, the United States has been waging a proxy war on Russia, and then the past 4 years, it's claimed the lives of tens of thousands of Russians. So, of course, they would like to have some military position where they can then threaten the U.S. In the same way. Now, I'm not sure, to what extent or what the strategy of the Russians are, but you would assume that they would look for a way to balance off the United States. Of course, we played this game before during the Cold War, and it can go very wrong very quickly. So again, I don't think the Russians could put themselves in a situation similar to what the US have done, where the United States now launches ATACMS into Russian cities, killing Russian soldiers. I mean, imagine if the situation was reversed, that from Venezuela or Cuba, you would have Russian contractors launching Russian missiles, following Russian satellites, targeting American cities with targets picked by Russian war planners, and they would simply call this, it's just the Cubans defending themselves. It would never work. The Americans would probably find a way of retaliating directly against Russia. Of course, this is how what the United States have been doing towards Russia. So it's so they're probably looking for a way to step up the pressure on the United States. But beyond that, I'm not really sure. Regarding Venezuela, though, I think it's not as if they just want an ability to trade. You can go to you want the ownership of the country almost. I mean, you can compare to late 2013. This was when the Europeans were putting pressure on, and the Americans were putting pressure on Ukraine to take this deal, which the EU presented. At that time, the Ukrainians with the Russians presented a counter proposal, which was a Ukraine, Russia, EU trilateral deal. So Ukraine wouldn't have to choose. It can be a bridge. It can prosper by trading with both. And the EU rejected this deal immediately. And instead, what you got after the coup in February of 2022 was that the intelligence services of Ukraine were taken over almost on the first day by the United States and the British, which has been very openly reported on in the New York Times and Washington Post. You saw that the new finance minister of Ukraine which came in was an American citizen. You saw key areas of the political establishment being installed by the United States, and all new appointments had to be approved by the United States. And you saw all of its economic deals being disconnected from Russia and reoriented towards the West. So it's not just, let's work, trade together and make a deal. This is a great power play. So you want to not just strengthen yourself, but weaken your opponents. So you also have to cut off Venezuela from the Chinese, from the Russians. So what the Americans want is not what Maduro is necessarily offering.
I wonder, as you're explaining that, I began thinking, I wonder if there's a similar goal here. And I'd love to know your thoughts on the Ukraine minerals deal. 18 months ago, I think this was signed. And, at a super high level, it creates a jointly owned fund between the Ukrainians and the Americans that is contributed to dollar for dollar. But the benefit to the Americans is that military value contributes to their side of the fund. And so if the United States provides $50 million worth of weapons, Ukraine is obligated to provide $50 million worth of cash into this fund that then gets priority on every new natural resource project inside the country of Ukraine. And their 50 million would come from existing natural resource cash flows within the country. And a couple of the little key points of this deal is that first, you get first rights of refusal on every new deal in the country, which is every investor's dream. But secondly, they can actually apply veto power to who the output of that natural resource deal is sold to. So if it's a critical metals deal and the US wants that supply, they can opt to buy it. If they don't, they can then govern who does get to buy it, and most importantly, who doesn't get to buy it. And so it's pseudo control over 100% of the minerals to be developed in the Ukraine. And I could see a similar structure being very appealing to the American administration in Venezuela. When I saw that deal signed, my first thought was this sort of incentivizes the United States to provide more weapons, because every time they do, they're met on par dollar value in this new fund. My second thought was, yes, but war doesn't really allow for productive extraction of natural resources. And so peace is more probable, because in peace, you can actually build and extract and build the infrastructure required to extract that wealth from the ground. But maybe you got to fund it first. And that's why weapons got to come for a year, 2 years, 3 years to build up the account balance. And then you can deploy in a time of peace down the road. Any take on that, Glenn? Thoughts on the Ukraine minerals deal and a similar structure maybe being in the back or the front of the minds in Venezuela today?
I assume they would like a similar deal with Venezuela, but this is making Ukraine a colony, though. This is much like in the past, of course. There's some minor differences, but this is also what's the great danger of Ukraine to be used as a proxy in a war between NATO and Russia, because it will get hurt on both sides. That is, on one hand, the country that's being used to fight against Russia will then take what it wants from Ukraine. And of course, the Ukrainians have made itself economically and militarily dependent on can also strip it of what it needs. So, and this creates a big problem, because once the Americans now are going after its resources, it creates a competition for who gets to control Ukraine's resources, because now the chance of Ukraine controlling that itself, being a stable, neutral buffer with control over its own resources, that ship has sailed. So that this is already gone. So, so for the Russians now, they have a big incentive to conquer a lot of the territories which a lot of the resources are on. And if you look at where most of the gas, oil, lithium, all of these things are, the good agriculture as well, it's in the historical territories of Russia. That's from Kharkov all the way to, well, the four regions which Russia seized now, plus Crimea, but also Kharkov, it's Dnipro, Nikolaev, and Odessa. So these are the historical Russian territories. This is also the entire coastline, and of course where the most interesting resources are. So it's not just that Russia gets it in its own hands, but it's also that it keeps the United States and the Europeans away as well. So once you strip it of some territory, it reduces its market value for the West. So now there's a huge incentive to just strip Ukraine of most of its territory, at least the historical Russian territory. And but you also see it taking shape in other ways. That is the seizure of Russian money. That is the American peace deal. If you saw the peace plan, it looks like a business deal. They would like to be able to, for example, use some of the frozen Russian assets to rebuild. I guess the Americans want to make a profit there, while the Europeans would like to seize all this money, which is why now the EU has permanently seized. I say permanently because they now need the authorization of all EU member states to release the money. There's no renewal of these sanctions through votes. So they're now looking at a way of stealing this money permanently from the Russians. So everyone is looking now towards the end of this war, how they can make some money. And Ukraine will get the short end of this stick, as everyone is stripping Ukraine now of its resources.
That's such an interesting way to view this conflict. And I think it's bang on. Now is the time when everybody has arrived at the table to see what they can get out of this deal, right? As things begin to wind down, the sense of urgency to claim what you might have access to increases. It's so important to pay attention to what's in the ground in those borderlands. You mentioned the grain. I think 25% of the world's grain comes from the Ukraine and Russia. A quarter of the world's grain from that region. It's significant, in addition to many other resources. Please go ahead.
But no, well, at one point, you had a German economic minister as well. I think that was him at least, who came out and said, "Oh, we can't afford to let Donbass fall to the Russians. This is where all the lithiums are. If we're gonna be able to develop a green Europe, Ukraine has to be connected to the EU, not Russia." I mean, all of this is just obviously they don't want them to sell it to the Chinese either. Then, so all of this it's a colonial project. It's not just that they want access. They don't want the other centers of power to have access either. So this is what happens when the open international economic system breaks down. Everyone will seek exclusive control. And, it's not that unlike the late 19th century. That is when, especially after 1880, when the industrial powers begin to compete more, all ideas of a liberal system begins to break down, and you carve up the world between you. I think it's to a large extent what we're seeing now as well.
Yeah, and it's you look at the expansion of the critical minerals list in the United States. These are the minerals that the U.S. deems critical to their national security, and it's been increasing in number every year. I mean, in 2018, there was 35 minerals on that list. 2018, today there's 60. It's nearly doubled. More and more of the resources that exist in the crust of the earth are deemed critical to the United States national security. All that does is provide a bit of an explanation about why we're going to step outside the historic boundaries and rules and expectations and operate differently. And maybe that's the Ukraine minerals deal. Maybe that's a similar deal in Venezuela. Maybe that's all the state capitalism initiatives we've seen domestically. The United States government now becoming an active equity investor in mining companies all over the country. The Department of Defense put over $400 million into MP Materials, the only U.S. rare earth miner and refiner. They're now the biggest shareholder of MP Materials. 35 million into Trilogy Metals, owning 10% of that critical metal project up in Alaska. Lithium Americas, U.S. antimony, like it goes on and on and on. Notwithstanding like the U.S. Steel deal with Nippon Steel, right? That merger was blocked between Nippon Steel and U.S. Steel, and then it was approved under the condition that the U.S. government would retain the golden share in U.S. Steel, which gives them a lot of veto power about how that American based operation conducts itself, who they sell steel to, when they shut down, at what cost they produce, all of this stuff. And this trend of you just got to call it state capitalism, that's what it is very distasteful to people in the West, but it's crept in, and I think a part of a trajectory that's not going anywhere, and explains a lot, right? I think this explains a lot, whether it's capital being directly allocated to U.S. companies. This is kind of the China model, this private-public partnership, and we're going to not just provide tax incentives and subsidies, we're going to directly own key industries and companies to make sure that we're moving at the pace that we want them to. But in addition, it I think explains a lot about the conquest in Ukraine, the conquest in Venezuela, is that there's a new sense of urgency to retain secure supply of these critical metals that we used to be able to buy from anybody during the last 40 years. If you have the cash or the credit, era of globalization, buy whatever you want from whoever had it. That era is definitely over. And so everyone's going to act differently now, especially the powerful countries. And it provides a lot of clarity. I don't know if you find this, Glenn, but I find a lot of clarity when I view these complex issues through the lens of simple supply and demand. It's like, really, that's often what it comes down to. Who's got what, who wants what. And that'll tell you a lot about what's happening beneath the surface.
No, I agree. And I think one of the key reasons why, again, you mentioned all this United States, well, the government going to take ownership in tech companies and all. This is almost science fiction 20 years ago, but this is what they're doing. But there's a reason behind this, because the United States can't compete with China to the same extent it did in the past. And it's worth, I often like going back to the American system, because the way the United States spoke when Britain was the dominant economy towards the end of the 18th century, beginning of the 19th century, many of the Americans were talking about the free trade empire, because once you had free trade, this would facilitate the British Empire, because if the British had the dominant technologies and industries in a free trade system, you would have then the British would be able to saturate markets around the world and prevent the industrialization of others. Again, this was a key objective, because if you then have British industries which are high tech and low cost, and they compete with the American ones, which were low quality and high cost, then of course the British will take over all markets. So the Americans said, we don't want free trade, we want fair trade, which means we have to also industrialize as a condition for political sovereignty. Otherwise, we might have won our independence, but we will become economically dependent on the British. Well, once the American became dominant, then they embraced the same policies. They say, well, of course, free trade is good, because now they will all use American industries, American tech, the incentives to use their currency, banks, transportation corridors under control of the U.S. Navy. So, but what happens? It's also a question: what happens when the concentration of economic power in the United States begins to dwindle? Many people have discussed this, especially in academia, since the late 70s and 1980s, and one would then assume that what would happen is what's happening now. The U.S. wouldn't feel so comfortable anymore with free trade, because, let's say now China has the most mature industries. That is, it has the high quality, low cost ones. If you have a completely open market field, well, the whole world would begin to embrace Chinese technologies, Chinese products. So this is not ideal. So what happens then to the former hegemon? It would begin to suspend its former ideology about the glories and mutual benefit of free trade, and would begin to embrace much more of a neo-mercantilist economic policy, in which it seeks to carve out the exclusive economic zones and engage in what you see now: piracy, cutting off access to banks, stealing sovereign funds of other countries. I mean, this kind of behavior. So to a large extent, this has been predicted already that this would happen. So no, but it's 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 just if people diagnose it properly, at least one can start to look for how to stabilize this, because it's not going anywhere pretty, I think, over the next few years. Because the idea that the Russians, Chinese, and other centers of power is just going to stand idly by while this more forceful capitalism, state capitalism, takes place, I think it's delusional, and it's also been fueled in the 1990s in the unipolar moment. We could do anything we want. We can sanction other countries. They can't sanction us. We can do coercion. We can hijack ships. We can do all these things. They can't do the same back to us. Well, I think a lot of this is going to change. Look at how surprised Europeans were after the Dutch seized the Nexperia from the Chinese, and then the Chinese suddenly put some sanctions on the Dutch. Which threatened the car industry in Europe. They're outraged. How dare they? This is, when we do economic sanctions, it's out of virtue. It's about defensive requirements, is for democracy, all of this nonsense. But China's not allowed to do it. So the whole, there's no one accepting that the world has moved on, that the distribution of power is completely different.
One region that we haven't talked about yet is very close to where you are. So we've covered the Caribbean, and we didn't talk about the South China Sea today, but I want to cover the Arctic and get your thoughts on what people should maybe be paying attention to in the Arctic. And I think about, Canada's north is one of the most minerally endowed locations in the world, between the Yukon, the Northwest Territories, none of it, massive amounts of resource wealth. And, many companies that I work with are exploring and producing minerals up in that region. Canada's got the largest coastline in the world. It's largely undefended. And most of the history, it hasn't mattered because the Arctic's been too frozen to really facilitate much threat. But that's changing, right? We've got the Northwest Passage where trade has occurred, but now there's the Northern Sea Route, which is closer to Russia, that is melting, and ships are able to get through an increasing number every year. There was a lot of initial sort of commentary around this when President Trump was first elected, his second term. He talked about annexing Greenland, annexing Canada. And my thought was, it's all about the North. It's all about the North because, Canada has not built much defense competency, around such a wealthy region. But Prime Minister Mark Carney has now promised a 5x increase in defense spending. A lot of that cash will be allocated to the northern coast. And I've seen a lot of companies already begin to emerge, defense tech companies that are either building proprietary surveillance and software systems for the North, or just planning on white labeling American tech and bringing it to the northern coastline to tap into that new government budget. Are you watching the Arctic, Glenn? What are you paying attention to? What matters at this point? What's changed today versus 5 or 10 years ago that is significant?
Oh, well, I interpreted Trump's early months in the same way. That is, he wants to annex Greenland. He wants to annex Canada. He kept obsessing about how many icebreakers the Russians have to operate the Northern Sea Route, while America doesn't have these capabilities, or any of its allies. A lot of things have changed, and it preceded Trump. Again, Trump is, I think, a symptom with some very unique characteristics. But nonetheless, as you suggested in the past, the Arctic was largely exempted from geopolitics, at least the most vicious part of it, because it was a frozen desert, not that many zero-sum competing interests. Again, in the Arctic Council as well, it's been kind of unique because you have Russia and all these other Western countries, but they were still able to cooperate and work. So when I go visit, in this country, for example, Arctic University up in the north, they have good relations with Russia. They always have this good human-to-human contacts. All the stuff they're working on can have a very strong positive sum purpose. But what's happened over the past few years, as you said, the much of the Arctic is becoming more accessible, which means both extraction of natural resources, but also as transportation. Now, this northern sea route, that is the roof of Eurasia, if you will, it offers a much faster and cheaper connection route between Europe and East Asia. So, and also it's one of the few, if not the only, maritime route which is not under the control of the United States. But again, if you're going to sail through there, you will have to go through some of the Russian waterways, and also no other countries have the ability to navigate along this line. So the Russians will be able to have the infrastructure, they will have the search and rescue, they will have everything. So this is geography essentially hands over this important region to the Russians. And in the past, the Russians wanted to develop the Arctic with the Western powers, but this all ended in 2014 when the NATO countries toppled the government in Ukraine and essentially began converting it into a front line from day one. So now they're working with China, and I think the first white paper for China in 2018, it referred to the Arctic as the polar Silk Road. So they already conceptually integrated it into this new Silk Road. The Russians are also seeking cooperation with India and other countries as well up in the Arctic. They already the connection between the Chennai port of India and Vladivostok in Russia is already being integrated into this new Arctic route. So it will be quite important. And as you said, just like the Canadian Arctic, the Russian Arctic is incredibly wealthy in resources. So now the main partner for Russia and the Arctic will not be the West; it will be China. And China, in some creative geographical lingo, refer to themselves as a near Arctic state, and which is fair enough. And but they're being invited by Russia, which is the largest Arctic state. So it irrespective of how they frame it, they can be there as well. So no, I think the Arctic is going from one of the places where there was no rivalry to one of the possibly greatest hotspots we have. And you also see the Americans preparing Europe for this. That is, for the past centuries, if you wanted to contain Russia, you had to cut off its main three seas on its western borders, which was the Black Sea, the Baltic Sea, and the Arctic. NATO has been doing this for the past 30 years now. There hasn't been, well, it's not a big secret that the efforts to pull Ukraine into the NATO orbit was to a large extent to cut off Russia from the Black Sea. You have now, with NATO expansion, taking over Finland and not taking over, absorbing Finland and Sweden. We see now that the former NATO Secretary General said that the Baltic Sea is now a NATO lake. We can even put a blockade on St. Petersburg if we have to. The Poles, the Baltic states also refer to the Baltic Sea as a NATO lake. And then, of course, in the Arctic, where the Scandinavian countries are now hosting more and more American troops, especially with Finland and Sweden in NATO, and Norway, which didn't used to accept foreign troops on its soil. Well, this is all over. So the Arctic can also become, we're making ourselves into a front line in the Arctic. So it's, a lot of things are happening there, and it wouldn't surprise me if that would be one of the bigger hotspots in the years to come.
I want to put a pin in that, because it was maybe 1 year ago that we were in Indonesia. My family and I had our mutual friend Pascal Lota on the show, and we were running through the various sort of flashpoints around the world. We spent a lot of time talking about the South China Sea, a lot of time talking about the Strait of Hormuz, the Sahel region across Africa, where we saw this just series of coups for 3 or 4 years straight. And then we touched on the Caribbean, and our where we left it was, there's nothing happening there, but it seems like something might, right? There's a lot of tension building up. This is about 1 year ago. And obviously we've seen how that's developed. And I feel like the Arctic is a place people should keep a close eye on for all the reasons you just discussed, for how much value is up for grabs up there and therefore needs to be defended or secured. And in addition, how little people understand the region, because it's been offline for my entire life. This has been a part of the world that's been not navigable. And now it is increasingly. And there's new interest moving in seemingly monthly. Notwithstanding, people don't understand it so much because it's just hard to picture. I mean, you go to Google Maps, scroll up to the top, the map just stops. You can't really get a bird's eye view of what the top of the world looks like on the most common mapping platform that everybody uses. And so, of course, it's a bit of misunderstanding about how the navigation functions up there. Go to Google Earth, flip it, have a look at the top. But that's what we're talking about, is now navigating over the top of the world. And that's what shortens trade routes, makes trade a lot more affordable and accessible for Russia via the Northern Sea route. But there's a lot of reasons that has been off the radar, and suddenly it's not. And a place to watch for sure.
But it's interesting to also put in the historical context. If you want to see the rise of the West for the past, or dominance or leadership for the past 500 years, a lot of it began when the ancient Silk Road broke down, and from the beginning of the 16, from the 1500s, beginning of the 16th century, the Western, the European maritime powers began to reconnect the world, and this kind of became a source for dominance. But what was interesting is they also tried to connect the world through the Arctic. And this is why, if you look at where in the north, where the Europe meets Russia, the Barents Sea, this is named after William Barents, who in the late 16th century, so yeah, what is it, 430 years ago, he tried to search for a northern passage from Europe to Asia, and they essentially got stranded. I think it was on Novaya Zemlya, somewhere around that area, and they all died. So it didn't work. They didn't get there. But that's why we call it now the Barents Sea, the sea between, which is now split a bit between the Norwegians and the Russians. And this is why it kind of fits into it was a missing piece, I guess, from that era of exploration, when the Europeans began to control the world. And so again, this was supposed to be developed with the Europeans, and this is one of the consequences of the Ukraine war. That is, that relationship is now broken up. Russia shifted from this greater Europe ambition since Gorbachev's common European home, and now pursuing greater Eurasia. So now the Arctic will be developed by countries in the East. And so it's very symbolic, I think, of how world history is changing. Anyways, just a quick detour there.
Yeah, well, it's an interesting part of history, right? And that sort of age of exploration at the beginning of the 16th century that you mentioned was sort of a consequence of trade restrictions, right? It was the Ottoman Empire putting massive tariffs on Europeans' access to the Spice Islands in Southeast Asia. And as a result of being cut off from the most important industrial inputs, I mean, spices today, we think of like, what could the value of cinnamon really be? But back then it was actually incredibly valuable. Black pepper, mace, cumin, incredibly valuable on a per weight basis, and not just used to spice foods, but for medicines and perfumes and a bunch of use cases. And that is what spawned the maritime age, was that the Europeans had to find another route to get to that natural resource. And they did. And I'm not as familiar with their pursuits in the Arctic during that time. I want to look into that. That's really interesting. Glenn, I always appreciate chatting with you. It's incredibly enlightening. And thank you so much for making the time to come back in the program. I'm going to be watching the Arctic very closely. And, you know, I have my annual conference in Vancouver in January. We've got the former Minister of Defense from Canada coming to sit down for an hour and just unpack what he's watching up there and why, because a lot's changed since he was in power in the Canadian government. And he's got some very strong thoughts on that. We've got a whole showcase of companies that have resources up in the Arctic through the Yukon, none of it, Northwest Territories. Some of the premiers from these territories coming to join us at the conference to unpack this region a little bit and understand it better, because its resources, its wealth, its government policy, all shifting very quickly to impact how that region is going to look over the next 10 years. I'm glad we got to that today. I encourage everybody to check out your YouTube channel, Glenn. And you're publishing like almost daily now. If not, are you publishing daily on your channel?
Yeah, about one show every day. So yeah.
That's a huge lift. Congrats. And congrats on the growth of the platform. I love your content. And anybody who's interested in this kind of stuff, like check out Glenn's channel, tune in. Amazing content and amazing caliber of guests that you bring onto your show. And often people that are off my radar, I find them through you. So I appreciate that. Thanks again, Glenn. It's been a pleasure.
Oh, thank you.